Welcome to the OK Let's Learn podcast. This is two podcasts in one. One where we dive into tons of interesting topics, and another where we just dive into tons of interesting, family-friendly books and stories. My name is Kevin O'Keefe. So today, let's learn all about the United States Constitution. Yes, this is piggybacking on my previous episode on the United States Bill of Rights. Hey, the Constitution, we're definitely going to get to the Declaration of Independence, but today it's lasted 240 years. When you think of the Constitution, right, you got to think of freedom, rights, democracy, but guess what? It really is all that, but it's more of an instruction manual. It explains how the government works, who has what power, what each area of the government can and cannot do, and how, very simply, our country should be run. So, let's learn about the United States Constitution. To understand why we have it and what the circumstances were with its creation, you got to go back to the Revolutionary War. We won our independence from Great Britain in 1783 when the Treaty of Paris was signed. You had now 13 colonies that were now 13 independent states. But there was a huge problem and a huge question. How could these individual little states, they're almost like little countries, how could they come together to form the United States of America? You see, what was on everyone's mind is we just fought against the tyranny of a huge national government, the king, parliament. The last thing that all the 13 colonies was another powerful national government. So instead of creating a strong central government, what did we do? We created something a lot weaker. And initially, it made sense. This was the Articles of Confederation. It was our very first national government. It actually had been approved by the Continental Congress in 1776, just after the Declaration of Independence, but it officially didn't take effect until 1781, after all the 13 colonies/states finally agreed to them. Think about that. This is now basically 2 years before the war officially was over. It took so long because obviously every individual state wanted their own kind of independence, their own power. But here's the thing. They agreed that all together they would be better than individually. So they did keep the national government there, but they kept it intentionally weak. Each state wanted its own power. And ultimately, sounds like a good idea, but immediately problems started appearing. And it's common sense, right? You got 13 people. There's no way 13 people can get together and agree on everything. Well, this was the case. Here was the major weaknesses with the Articles of Confederation. Congress at the national level couldn't collect taxes. Instead, it had to ask politely for the states for money. Sometimes the states paid, sometimes they didn't. There was no enforcement. Trade. There was no set rules nationally between states. They made their own rules. And Congress again, couldn't create their own national court system. And there was no president to carry out the laws. There wasn't even a strong national army. If trouble came up, Congress had to basically go to all the states and to send soldiers and to remediate any kind of problems. Imagine running a country where every important decision depended on, like I said, 13 different governments agreeing. It just was a train wreck, figuratively speaking, right from the beginning. And the turning point, no doubt, where most of the states agreed that something had to be changed, was in 1786. It was this fellow by the name of Daniel Shays. It became known as the Shays Rebellion. He led a whole bunch of disgruntled farmers in Massachusetts to the courthouse, and he attacked. And immediately what everyone throughout all the states realized is that they had no way to stop this rebellion. Eventually, militia was brought up at the state level, and they sent him back. But it was a wake-up call, because there was nothing that the army or anyone in government could do to stop these mobs, these protests. So almost immediately, yes, all these names are familiar. They began calling for a meeting. George Washington, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, and many others. Originally, all they planned on doing was revising the Articles of Confederation, but soon they realized that the whole thing had to be shredded, and they had to start from scratch and start a whole new system of government. It was May 1787, and delegates from 12 of the 13 states gathered in Philadelphia. Only Rhode Island refused to attend because it had feared a strong national government. The meetings took place inside Independence Hall. Yes, it's still there. The windows were kept closed despite the summer heat. Guards stood outside. The delegates agreed to keep everything that they were talking about secret. Why? Because they wanted everyone to speak honestly without newspapers getting involved, people from outside getting involved. They wanted to get down to business. They wanted to be productive. And yes, every single day, every single moment, there were arguments. There were compromises. And yes, the big one was disagreements over slavery. And another huge issue was they were arguing about how the states should be represented. Larger states wanted more power. Smaller states wanted equal power. Sometimes it looked like the entire convention would collapse, but eventually, after 4 months, they put together this amazing document, the Constitution of the United States. It was signed on September 17th, 1787. It did not immediately become law. Why? Because each state had to vote on whether it was going to accept it. The delegates decided that approval of 9 of the 13 states would be enough for it to take effect. New Hampshire became the 9th state in June of 1788 and officially became the law of the land then in 1789. Soon afterward, George Washington officially became our first president. So what exactly is the Constitution? It does 4 major things. First, it creates a national government. Second, it divides power among 3 branches of government. Third, it limits the government's power. And fourth, it explains how the Constitution itself can be changed. Surprisingly, the entire Constitution is only about 4,500 words long. That's shorter than most magazine articles. Yet it became certainly one of the most influential documents in world history. And hey, most people have never read it from beginning to end. Really, that's the purpose of this episode, so you can kind of basically understand what it is, number one, but what is in it. The first is the preamble. It begins with just 52 words. And yeah, they're famous words. We the people. Those 3 words were revolutionary. Instead of saying government gets its power from a king, the Constitution says government gets its power from the people. The preamble lists 6 goals. 1, to form a more perfect union. 2, to establish justice. 3, to ensure domestic tranquility or keep peace at home. 4, provide for the common defense. 5, promote the general welfare. And 6, to secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and future generation. The preamble doesn't create laws. Instead, it explains why the Constitution exists. So, what else is in the Constitution? Well, it has 7 articles. You can call them 7 sections. And each one, all of them in totality, the purpose of the articles is to establish the framework for how our government works, how it's going to be set up, and how it will function. So Article 1 is all about the legislative branch, the branch of government that makes the laws. And yes, it's the longest article, and that's no accident. The founders believed Congress should be the most powerful branch because it directly represents the people. Congress makes the nation's laws, and it has 2 parts. One is the House of Representatives, and one is the Senate. The House represents the people based on population. More people means more representatives. The Senate gives each state an equal number of representatives. So each state gets 2 senators, whether it's California, Wyoming, or little Rhode Island. Article 1 also gives Congress many important powers. It collects taxes, it can borrow money, it can print money, it regulates trade, it declares war, it raises and supports the military, it creates the post office, and it passes laws needed to carry out its responsibilities. But Congress has its limits. It cannot violate constitutional rights of the people, and it cannot grant titles of nobility. Interesting, right? Going back to England. And it cannot simply do anything it wants, right? Well, Article 2 is all about the second of 3 branches of government, and it's the executive branch. It created the presidency. The president's job is not to make laws. The president's job is to carry out those laws. The president also is the commander-in-chief of the military. He's the chief diplomat. He's the head of the executive branch. And he's responsible for making sure federal laws are enforced. Article 2 also explains how presidents are elected through the Electoral College. It describes how impeachment works if people want to remove their president, and it lists the qualifications of who can be president. President has to be 35 years old, has to be a natural-born citizen, and has to have lived in the United States for at least 14 years. Article 3, the judicial branch, the branch that has the Supreme Court. It created the Supreme Court. Its job is to interpret laws, to make sure the laws are fair, right? So Congress makes the laws, Article 1. The president carries out the laws, Article 2. And then Article 3, the Supreme Court of the judicial branch makes sure that these laws are fair. When people disagree about a law that Congress passes under Article 1, the courts decide under Article 3. Federal judges, listen to this. It says they serve during, quote, good behavior, unquote, which basically means that they can serve for life unless they resign, retire, or removed if they're impeached. Judges can be impeached as well. The Constitution doesn't actually say that there must be 9 Supreme Court justices, even though there are. Congress decides that number. Interesting, right? Okay, the separation of powers. The founders worried about giving too much power to any one person, so they divided the government, like I said, through these 3 articles into 3 branches. And each branch has different responsibilities. It's called basically checks and balances. The Constitution goes one step further. Each branch can limit the others. Congress passes the laws. The president can veto them. Congress can override a veto with enough votes. A veto is basically saying, nope, I'm the president, I'm one person, Even though all of you, hundreds of people in Congress, just passed this law, I don't like it, so I am not going to approve it, and it won't go into effect. So the president also can appoint judges, but the Senate has to confirm them. The Supreme Court can rule that laws that were passed by Congress and signed off by the president can say that those laws are invalid, they're unconstitutional. And Congress can impeach, get rid of presidents and judges, and no branch gets unlimited power. That system is called checks and balances. So this separation of powers and this checks and balances I just referenced, that's spread and written into the Constitution right from Article 1 through Article 3. Article 4 through Article 7 are shorter, but they're still very important. Article 4 explains how states should treat one another. They must generally respect each other's laws and court decisions. It also explains how new states can join the Union. Every state after the original 13 entered under this process. Article 5 explains how the Constitution can be changed. Changes are called amendments, right? We talked about amendments. Those Bill of Rights, those are the first 10, and they're amendments. They first must be proposed, usually by 2/3 vote in both houses of Congress. Then they have to be ratified by 3/4 of the state. Today, with 50 states, that means 38 states must prove an amendment. Definitely talked about this all in our episode on the Bill of Rights. The process is intentionally difficult. The founders wanted the Constitution to be stable, not constantly changing. Article 6 says the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. If a state law conflicts with the Constitution, guess who wins? The Constitution. Federal officials, people in the national government, and state officials as well, must swear an oath to support the Constitution. The article also says there can be no religious test for holding a federal office. And finally, Article 7 simply explained how the Constitution would take effect. Only 9 states approved it. The new government could begin. And that's exactly what happened. So what happened next? As we talked about, the Bill of Rights was then added simply because many people worried it didn't do enough, this new Constitution setting up the government, it didn't do enough to protect individual freedoms. Several states said they would only approve the Constitution if a Bill of Rights was added. And so, yes, eventually Congress proposed 12 amendments. 10 were ratified by the states. And these first 10 amendments, like I mentioned, became the Bill of Rights. And they protected speech, religion, press, right to bear arms, jury trial, due process, protection from unreasonable government searches. So, although many people think the Constitution and the Bill of Rights are one document, they're not. They were actually written separately. The Constitution came first. And yes, the Bill of Rights was afterwards. But they're amendments, believe it or not. So why has this piece of paper lasted so long? Many countries have rewritten their constitutions over and over. We, the United States, has kept the same Constitution since 1789. Why? Because it was written with really broad principles rather than detailed instruction. It created a system that can change and adapt as the country changed. So many things that we recognize today, here when this podcast is sent out here in 2026, no way the founders could have envisioned, right? So they understood that it would change. And remarkably, it's only been changed 27 total times, 17 after that original Bill of Rights in 1789. Really remarkable. So to wrap up our podcast, The U.S. Constitution just isn't an old document that's sitting there behind glass in Washington, D.C. It's a whole framework for how our government operates every single day. And when something goes wrong, if someone says something is not right, people will just point to the Constitution and say, well, is it there? Yeah, it is. Okay, so that's our law of the land. It's not there. That doesn't make sense. Okay, let's check it out there. Maybe we can change it. So really, it explains who has power, how that power is limited, and where that power ultimately comes from. It doesn't come from a king. It doesn't come from a president. It doesn't come from hundreds of people in Congress. And it doesn't come from these 9 people sitting there in the Supreme Court with their robes on. It comes from people themselves. Yes, we the people, 350 million people today. And this idea remains the defining principle of our country more than 2.5 centuries later. But to wrap up, having said all this, it's so important to remember that no way was it perfect when it was written. One of the greatest failures was that it did not end slavery. In order to get enough states to agree, the delegates made the painful compromise that allowed slavery to continue for decades. And we know our country almost ended because of this disagreement. We went to war against each other. The Constitution also originally left many Americans without any voice in their government. Think about it. Women, Native Americans, and many Black Americans. Over time, yes, through the constitutional amendments, new laws, new court decisions, the country has worked to correct many of these shortcomings, but those changes took generations. And like I said, we had to go through a terrible civil war to right our wrongs. Perhaps one of the Constitution's greatest strengths is that the founders, the authors, understood that they couldn't predict the future. Like I mentioned before, they created a way to change it, allowing later generations to make it better as the nation changed. It doesn't mean every problem has been solved, even till today, or that everyone agrees on how the Constitution should be interpreted. But the Constitution's ability to change and evolve while preserving the basic framework of how our government works is one of the main reasons it's lasted all of these years. Friends, thanks for taking this journey, learning all about the United States Constitution. Reach out to me at kevmok21@gmail.com. This is for requests for future episodes. This is feedback. This is anything that you'd like to let me know. Believe it or not, I know a lot of you are listening, but I don't know who is listening, so I'd love to hear from you. We are on X. We are on YouTube. We are on Facebook. We are on Spotify. Hit that plus button on Apple Podcasts to follow the podcast, subscribe to the podcast. I love those ratings. I love those reviews. And until next time, have fun and keep learning.